Everyone for coming to our very last AIH seminar today. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. William D'Alessandro from the University of Oxford. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, it's been an amazing week. So much good AI stuff. Just so good to be here in Hong Kong. Thanks to you guys for having me. I appreciate you holding out for one last talk. A lot of this stuff is stuff that I've been thinking about in the last few months, especially since being at the Center for AI Safety. A lot of the sort of political philosophy content of this talk is due to talking to Nate, so thanks to Nate for the inspiration for a big part of this project. So what I want to do here is explore a tension between what I think are two appealing thoughts. So the first thought is that as AI continues to get better and better, and it's like easier to get it to do more things for us, there's a danger of losing control of the future in some sense. And many think it's very important that we don't lose control in that sense. The second thought is that actually, at least under certain circumstances, a future in which humanity has been technologically disempowered might still be really good in a lot of important ways. So in support of the first thought about the badness of losing control, some people who are interested in existential risk have classified this kind of loss of control as a risk of that magnitude, maybe like almost as bad as human extinction. So Toby Ord, for example, says, the ascendance of advanced AI needn't involve the extinction of humanity, but it could easily be an existential catastrophe nonetheless. Humanity would have permanently ceded its control over the future. I find this scenario the most plausible existential risk from AI. Similarly, Stuart Russell in his book says, look, AI is getting better and better. There are a lot of possible responses to that realization. We could stop doing AI research. We could just deny that there are risks. We could try to understand and mitigate the risks. Or we could simply resign and cede the future to intelligent machines. Resignation seems to be the worst possible response. So lots of people who have thought seriously about AI and existential risk think that this sort of loss of control could potentially be very bad. On the other hand, there are scenarios that seem to pull in the opposite direction. So turning from philosophy to fiction, like sci-fi contains examples of sort of future scenarios in which AI possesses sort of control in every important sense, and yet things seem pretty okay. So one example that gets talked about a fair bit is the Scottish sci-fi author Ian Banks's Culture novels. So in these stories, there are like 6 or 7 of them. They're very good. You should go read them. There's this galaxy-spanning advanced civilization. It's run by these super intelligent AIs called minds. They make all the big decisions. Humans are there, but they're not really doing anything, sort of cosmically marginal. They couldn't sort of affect things going on in the broader universe or their own fate on any large scale. But like they seem to be living, pretty great lives. They have all of this advanced technology, all of these resources. It's this sort of wonderful post-scarcity liberal society. They can choose how they want to live. It's a diverse, complex, rich society. They can leave and rejoin the culture at will. Things seem to be going quite well for them in a lot of ways, in spite of their loss of control. And lots of readers of these books view this as like something like an ideal future, and Ian Banks himself thought so. So he said in an interview, "The culture is my vision of it, exactly the place I would like to live. I can't imagine a better place. It's a utopian society." And interestingly, he highlighted this absence of human control as not like a flaw, it's good in spite of that, but actually as a desirable feature. So he said, it would be cool if the moral responsibility was taken away from us by incredibly clever and cool, wise machines, and we were just free to get on with being human within a general benign moral framework. So So I think that's really interesting, and it seems to me like there's cause for philosophers to think about this apparent clash of intuitions. Right, so just to spell this out a bit more, if indeed losing control of the future is really bad, then we should presumably, be afraid of worlds like banks where humans have been totally disempowered. But, intuitively, it's hard to feel like things are going really badly in these kinds of scenarios. So what's going on here? Is one thought or the other just wrong? Is there some more complicated situation where like losing control would be bad under some circumstances but okay under others? Then what are the relevant difference-making factors if that's the case? And all things considered, like what is the ideal future power relationship between humans and AI? What kind of future should we be aiming for? What kind of balance of power? What are the ways in which we should retain control? So these are big questions. They deserve a lot of thought, and there's a bigger project here, but I'm going to make a small start. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is try to get a little bit clearer about this notion of control of the future, because I'm not sure it's super obvious what that's supposed to mean. So kind of strangely, even though people classify this as a major existential risk, they don't often say exactly what it is that they're worried about. So here's like one of the closest attempts that I have seen of one of these authors to do this. So this is a long passage from Toby Ord again. He says, look, humanity is currently in control of its own fate. We can choose our future. We have differing visions of what that should be. But if enough humans wanted to, we could select any of a dizzying variety of possible futures. The same isn't true of chimpanzees or blackbirds or any other species. What would happen if researchers created an artificial general intelligence surpassing human abilities in almost every domain? In this act of creation, we would cede our status as the most intelligent entities on Earth. So without a very good plan to keep control, we should also expect to cede our status as the most powerful species and the one that controls its own destiny. So that's interesting, suggestive, still pretty vague, but I think like we can extract at least like the following properties that Ord thinks loss of control has. First of all, he thinks current humans possess it, like collectively, while other species don't. It seems like what he's talking about involves something like the ability to sort of deliberately select and intelligently try to realize some future states of the world. And also he thinks that if we create an uncontrolled, super intelligent AI, we're likely to lose control in this sense. So that's a start. I think it's still pretty vague. So I'm going to offer something a little bit more precise. So this is the thesis I'm calling control that offers a definition of the notion of control I want to focus on. So I'm going to say that an individual or group agent A possesses control of humanity's future, or CHF, just in case. First of all, that agent is able to plan for and pursue complex, contingent, large-scale states of the world that bear significantly on the nature or quality of collective human life. Second, that agent is capable of realizing some of those plans. Third, whether or not they do succeed at realizing any of those plans isn't determined primarily by an outside agency. Right, so there's a lot to say about all of these things and other aspects of this picture, but for now, let me just say the first condition says that it's not enough to just be able to sort of pursue small, local, mundane goals, because otherwise, like, chimpanzees would have control of their future. The second condition says that it's not enough just to pursue these big goals, you actually have to have the ability to realize some of them. And the third one says you have to be genuinely autonomous in some sense to possess control of the future, because if there's some other more powerful agent that's just sort of permitting or vetoing your attempts to change the future, then in some sense, that agent is really in control rather than you. So, okay, so there are other possible ways to think about what control of the future would be. I think this captures a lot of what's most interesting about the concept. And also, it dovetails with the suggestions of these authors we've seen that, that humanity would lose control of the future if a sufficiently powerful AI were created. So, okay. So that's the concept that I'm interested in. So a second issue to get clear about is, why does this concept matter so much, assuming that it does matter? What is it exactly that we stand to lose that's so valuable by ceding control to AI? And whatever it is that we stand to lose, how does that compare to what we stand to benefit? You might also want to know, what's the ideal sort of balance of these things? How do we get, as much of the good stuff with as little of the bad stuff in one of these loss of control scenarios? Okay, so there's one like blindingly obvious reason to worry about control of our future, which is that in most scenarios, control of our future comes with the ability to do us lots of harm, right? So, and moreover, like relevant to AI specifically, if an AI escaped our control, then it might do that because it is indifferent to our interests or maybe even hostile to our interests. And a system like that may be likely to behave harmfully. Right, so of course, extinction, other kinds of large-scale harms are very good reasons to care about losing control of the future. Since that's so uncontroversial, I don't want to dwell on those kinds of harms. I think the more interesting question is whether loss of control would still be very bad, even if we survive and things are generally going okay. So from this point on, I want to focus on like a pretty rosy picture and ask like what might still be bad in that scenario. So I want to focus on scenarios where some AI system has control of our future, but it hasn't sort of committed any of these sins, right? So no sort of extensive human death or extinction, no widespread terrible suffering, no oppressive limitation of human freedom, no sort of curtailment of our development, no sort of human enfeeblement of the like WALL-E sort where we're sort of obligated to depend on AI in bad ways. Right, so I want to focus on cases where none of these bad things have happened. And it does seem at least possible for an AI system to have control of our future without doing any of those bad things. So for example, we might solve the alignment problem, and then we voluntarily hand over power to AI that we know to be friendly to our interests. Or maybe we sort of solve it and we get an AI that's cares about us a little bit, but also is like pursuing its own goals but doesn't want to kill us. Or we could just get lucky, we might create an unaligned superintelligence, but it just might happen to not care about us that much and go, count grains of sand or like fly off to another galaxy and watch something cool happening, and just, ignore us for a while at least. So there are lots of different scenarios in which AI could gain power. At least in some of those scenarios, it seems like we don't get any of these bad things happening. So this doesn't seem like a crazy scenario to think about. So that is this definition, control of humanity's future. So don't sweat the details too much, but you get the idea. It's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so again, like to sharpen these questions about the value of control of the future, I want to focus on scenarios where things are going pretty well for us, even though we've lost control. And so again, like you can think about these kind of sci-fi scenarios, like the culture universe as like a way to imagine what that might be like. The sort of post-scarcity society administered by some relatively friendly AI, where people are, free. They have lots of opportunities, lots of sort of standard well-being. And I mean, I think AI risk discussions, for good reason, tend to focus on the worst case scenarios, but I think it's also important to ask how good the better cases would be, and what it is that we want from them. Okay, so I think even with these optimistic assumptions, you might think, oh, well, like, this picture is so rosy. Is there anything interesting left to talk about once we've assumed away all of these, like, these harms? I think actually, yes, there are a lot of things you could still be worried about. Most of these I'm not going to talk about today. Many of them I do want to continue thinking about, or I have thought about. So some of the other things you might be worried about are things like the kinds of epistemic distortions that often result from power imbalances, like the kind that social epistemologists like to study. Things like stagnation, apathy, or fatalism that come from knowing we're not in charge of things anymore. Or neglecting our valuable capacities, developing those capacities. Nate talked the other day about artificial achievement. That's a thing maybe you're worried about, like in this sort of scenario. Maybe by seizing control of the future, AI is preventing us from achieving certain kinds of things that you might consider valuable, and so on. I don't think all of these are, I think maybe some of these are serious, genuine worries. Others I'm less worried about, but I think they're all things that are interesting to consider. I'm going to ignore all of these things in this talk and instead look more closely just at one potential worry, which has to do with human freedom or liberty in these kinds of futures. Okay. Okay, so here's the starting thought. So however well off we are in these kinds of utopian sci-fi worlds with our health and wealth and knowledge and wisdom, it does seem undeniable that losing control of our future means forfeiting some of our liberty or freedom in some sense. That seems to follow closely from what it means to lose control. There are, of course, several different notions of liberty in the political philosophy literature. I think the best one here to understand this kind of loss of liberty is the Republican notion of freedom, liberty as freedom from domination. So in this sense, what it means for one agent to dominate another is that the second is subject to the arbitrary exercise of the first's power. So I'll say more about that. And so sort of importantly, unlike the kind of negative liberty of liberal political philosophers, Republicans hold that the second agent is deprived of liberty in this situation, even if the first one never actually interferes with them, or if they interfere with them only in sort of friendly ways. So you don't need actual interference, you just need the sort of ability to interfere in an arbitrary way. So as Frank Lovett says, to have a master, good, bad, or indifferent, is to be dominated. So lots of people in this tradition think that domination is bad. I'll talk more about why. And intuitively, it does seem like losing control to AI would involve a domination relation in this sense. Right, so it's pretty easy to see why that should be, right? So if an AI system has the power to significantly influence our collective life, and whether or not it chooses to do that due to our choices, that's just, again, the definition of CHF, then the AI would seem to dominate whoever it can affect in those kinds of ways. All right, so.
About control by AI, incorporate control.
Yeah, I think we're going to do questions at the end.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so first question, like, this seems reasonable, but is this actually right? And second, if it is right, what does that imply about the badness of AI control? So I think there's actually some interesting political philosophy to do here. So one of the things I'm going to suggest is that there are actually rewards in both directions from thinking about applying these traditional philosophical notions to the problem of AI in the future. Okay, so answering these questions, I think we have to take a closer look at what Republicans have to say about domination. So on pretty much everyone's account, this notion of arbitrary power that I mentioned earlier is sort of a key concept of the account. So the kind of intuitive idea here is that A's power over B is arbitrary and hence deprives B of liberty in this Republican sense, when A can wield that power at will, sort of unfettered by any external constraints. But there's some interesting disagreements in the literature about how to make that more precise. What does at will mean? What kinds of constraints are important here? And the different views here, I think, carry different implications for this question of AI and control of the future. So let me mention three pretty prominent accounts from the literature. So maybe the most well-known one, the one due to Philip Pettit and others, the so-called substantive view of arbitrary power. What matters is that the parties who are affected don't have any say. So if I can't meaningfully affect the fact that you possess power over me, or how or when you choose to use your power over me, then you dominate me. You have arbitrary power. Another view is Frank Lovett's procedural view. So on his account, what matters is the lack of sort of clear governing mechanisms for the use of the power. So A's power is arbitrary when the rules and structures that constrain the use of the power they either don't exist, there are no rules, or B isn't in a position to know about them. Finally, Chris McCammon has a deliberative view, and on that view, the thing that matters is sort of having the prerogative to do whatever you want, to act unilaterally on the basis of your own sense of practical reason. So on this last view, my power over you is arbitrary if I don't have to think about what your views would be about what I should do and why. So McCammon calls this deliberative isolation, when I can sort of choose what to do in sort of a vacuum without taking your viewpoint into account. Okay, so more on those in a second. Again, so just to as a possibility check here, it does, I think, seem possible for AI systems that possess control of our future to dominate us in any of these ways without inflicting any of the large-scale harms that I mentioned earlier. Right, so again, think of culture-style benevolent AI administrators. They arguably dominate humans on all three of these views. Right, they wield uncontestable power that's governed by opaque rules. They're not obliged to take human viewpoints into account. Maybe in fact they choose to do so most of the time, but nothing forces them to do so. Okay, so maybe the more interesting question is could we avoid this? Is it possible for an AI that possesses control of the future to not dominate us in these ways? Is there any more sort of optimistic possibility where we hand over control of the future, but we don't get dominated as a result? So out of these three accounts of domination, I think it's easiest to see how a system's power could be non-arbitrary in this proceduralist sense that I mentioned. So as Lovett says, all that this would take is that the AI's behavior is governed by various provisions that are carefully instantiated in public laws and institutions, rigorously adhered to by all parties. Right? And it doesn't seem like there's any reason in principle why we couldn't set up some laws and institutions that AI systems had to abide by. And even if they did that, they could still control our future in various ways. But unfortunately, I don't think this is such good news for people who are worried about domination, because I think there are good reasons to reject this kind of account of arbitrary power. So for instance, one objection from the literature is that this kind of view seems to entail that a master doesn't dominate her slaves so long as there's a slave-holding system that's kind of transparently governed by rigorously applied rules. And that just seems wrong, I think. There's no lack of domination or reduction in domination just by adding in some laws and rules. And it seems like the same thing should go for AI systems as well. Just setting up some laws and rules doesn't eliminate domination. Right, because after all, like, you know, you can have these kinds of laws and institutions and structures that are just designed to favor the interests of the powerful and like disenfranchise the powerless. And, you know, they could function as sort of a theater of rules without, you know, actually empowering one of the parties in any meaningful way. And I think those should still count as domination relations for like any interesting purposes. Okay, so in spite of this prediction, I don't think proceduralism offers a compelling vision of what powerful, non-dominating AI should be, because I don't think it's a compelling notion of non-domination. Of course, that's not to say that like we shouldn't still have rules for AI governance. That still seems like a good idea, but I don't think that by itself gets you freedom from domination. Okay, so we have two more accounts of domination left. So could an AI system possess control of the future without being dominating in either of those senses? So maybe it seems clearest that possessing control of the future does entail domination in the substantive sense. So remember, in that sense, A's power over B is arbitrary when B can't do anything about it. Right, and again, that follows pretty much immediately from this notion of CHF, because by definition, it involves abilities to interfere with us, which we can't veto, we can't do anything about. That's just part of what I'm saying that it means to have control of the future. And that seems, you know, just a very small step away from arbitrary power in this sense. Of course, how much we're dominated depends on how much power the AI has. It could be more or less, but it does seem like wielding some amount of unchecked power is just part of what it means to control the future. Okay, so one interesting wrinkle is that some substantivists add an extra condition, which is that the dominating agent has to not just have arbitrary power, but has to be able to exercise it with impunity. And you can see why you might want to add that condition, right? In principle, I could stab you while we were walking down the street together. But intuitively, that doesn't mean that I dominate you, because, you know, I'd probably go to jail. And so I'm not entirely free to do whatever I want to you, because there's like the threat of these serious repercussions hanging over my head. So maybe this gives the substantivists like a way out. So maybe you can imagine an AI system that's powerful enough to control the future, but it's also subject to some kind of correction or shutdown if we disapprove of what it does. So it doesn't have impunity. It can do whatever it wants, but then we might, you know, punish it if it does. So if you think, you know, you have to also be able to act with impunity, then this kind of system wouldn't dominate us on this sort of strengthened substantive view. So like, I do think this is conceptually possible. This is like describing a coherent possibility, but it seems pretty unlikely to me that we find ourselves in that kind of case. So think about how and why an AI system would gain control of the future. It seems like there's basically two possibilities. Either we deliberately chose to give it broad kind of discretionary power over our fate because we trusted it and thought it was going to do good things, or because it took that kind of power from us. Right, so in the former case, if we handed it the power, right, if we had wanted veto power over the system's choices, we would have just, you know, implemented some kind of antecedent human review and approval procedure. And if we had done that, then the system wouldn't have had control of the future because we would be the ones in charge. We would be giving it permission to act. On the other hand, if it took power, you know, on its own, then that would presumably be because either it doesn't care what we think or because it thinks it can do a better job without us interfering. So in neither of these cases do we end up with something like this, where we end up with a system that it's strong enough to have control of the future, but it's limited enough that we can sort of meaningfully correct or stop it if we disapprove of it. So I think even if you're this kind of impunity-focused substantivist, then it's hard to see what kind of actually plausible course of events would give you an AI that possesses control but doesn't dominate us. Okay, finally, there's the deliberative view, and I think domination also looks quite hard to avoid on this view. So what McCammon says is that A dominates B when A can pay scant, if any, attention to what B thinks are reasons to cooperate or refuse. A can proceed on the assumption that B will go along with A's deliberatively isolated notions of what B should do. So I can ignore your viewpoint, or I can just, make up what I think you'll think or want. So applying this to this case, I think we need to think about what this kind of modal talk about like what A can do could mean in this context. Right, so on the one hand, it might refer to some kind of like legal or procedural rules or other kinds of social norms that govern A's decision making. But if the system is powerful enough to have control of the future, it can probably just ignore those rules if it really wants to, right? Because again, otherwise, if it couldn't just ignore them, then that means we're the ones making the decisions. That means the system doesn't actually possess control. So if there's like some legal procedural rules in place that like, if the AI is nice, it will follow them, but if it isn't nice, then it can ignore them. That's not really a check on the system's power. Alternatively, this kind of modal language might reflect some more binding restrictions, like physical or technical restrictions on what the system can do. But again, if you're constrained in that sort of way, it seems like you can't possess control of the future because there are ways in which you just are unable to act categorically. So whatever it is that the deliberativist wants to mean, or whatever they could mean by saying, the system can pay scant, if any, attention to what humans think are reasons to cooperate or refuse. If it just means like there's some rules in place that it'll follow if it's nice, that's not strong enough. But if it's so strong that it actually can't act at all, then it's not clear that it possesses control in the relevant sense. Okay, so overall conclusion from this part, I think on the most popular and also the most plausible accounts of what it means to dominate, it does look quite likely that an AI system that controlled humanity's future would dominate the humans under its influence. So again, I think the proceduralist account is the only one that doesn't clearly say that, but I don't think that's a very plausible account. I think on the other two accounts, it does look likely that these two things go together. Okay, so the last question I want to consider is, what's so bad about this? Why would this be bad if indeed it would be bad? And in other words, the question is, why is this kind of Republican freedom supposed to be valuable in the first place? Okay, so that's the last part of the talk. Okay, so again, going back to Pettit in one of his early sort of classic works on the topic, he has some interesting things to say about this, like why it is that non-domination matters. So Pettit thinks that non-domination is a primary good. That is, it's something that a person has instrumental reasons to want, no matter what else it is that they want. That's because for him, non-domination is tied to three other things that he thinks are pretty much universally valuable. So first of all, uncertainty. If you get rid of domination, then you take away some of people's uncertainty about ways in which they could be interfered with. Second, people don't have to be as strategic in their behavior if they're not subject to domination. And third, if you get rid of domination, you get rid of some of the harms associated with subordination relations, like certain kinds of social or psychological harms. And so Pettit actually has a strong view about the relationship between these two things. He thinks that there's something like, necessary and sufficient conditions here. So he says there's no promoting non-domination without promoting these three effects, and conversely, there's no promoting those effects without promoting non-domination. So that's why domination is supposed to be good on his account. Okay, so let's just grant him that these are valuable things which we should all want. That's fine. So is he right that whenever we increase domination, we always sort of restrict the supply of these goods? And in particular, if we think about scenarios where AI gains control, are these three goods sort of inevitably threatened in those scenarios? So I think the answer is complicated, but it's complicated in a way that I think is interesting for theoretical political philosophy. So like I said, I think there are sort of dividends in both directions here. Okay, so I'm going to take these three in reverse. So first of all, he talks about the harms associated with subordination. So maybe like if you know anything about Pettit, he famously has this like eye test for subordination or for domination, where, can you look, a person from the other group in the eye without feeling like a sense of having to like, be cowed by them or something? If so, then you're dominated, and if not, then maybe you're okay. You don't have to bow and scrape. You can sort of hold your head high. Whereas under domination, everyone knows that you're weaker, you're vulnerable, and therefore subordinate. And of course, like historically, when we have domination relations between social groups, these sort of dynamics tend to cause psychological harms, right? If I know that I'm like weak and vulnerable, then that can affect my sort of my sense of self-respect or my sense of agency. Seems bad for me. And also certain kinds of social ills, like you get a kind of marginalized underclass that people look down on. Those all seem bad. So would we expect all of these kinds of things under AI domination? I think that doesn't seem super obvious, right? So you can imagine lots of ways that these relations could look, but one way that they could plausibly look is that you've got some powerful AI system that is poised to intervene, but it doesn't really interact with humans very much. And it doesn't have any kind of like social relations with humans. There aren't sort of robots walking around in the street that are like forcing people to kneel or something like that. It's just off somewhere in some, fortified, computer center, and only some like technical people ever like directly interact with it. But certainly like something like the eye test isn't going to apply here. And it doesn't seem like humans would necessarily walk around feeling, inferior and subordinated. Of course, on the other hand, it probably could happen, right? So you could imagine some sort of culture-like utopia, and then just like turn up the dial a bit on like the extent to which AI is like doing surveillance and policing. I think maybe if you do that enough, then you get to a point where you get some of these harms from subordination. But I certainly don't think it's inevitable, and maybe it's not even super likely in what I think are the most plausible sorts of domination scenarios. So I don't think it's right, as Pettit says, that when you have domination, you always get this kind of harm, because I think like in an AI control scenario, we could quite possibly not get this kind of harm. Okay, so the second is the thing about about strategizing. So the idea here is that when you're dominated, you have to keep a weather eye on the powerful, anticipating what they'll expect of you and trying to please them, anticipating where they'll be and trying to stay out of their way. You have to have strategic deference and anticipation forced on you at every point. You can never sail on unconcerned in the pursuit of your own affairs, You have to navigate an area that is mined on all sides with dangers. So this is interesting. I think there's a few ways of thinking about what exactly the bad thing is supposed to be here. Maybe it's in part a kind of efficiency worry that I have to like waste a lot of time and resources thinking about like how to avoid offending you, and that's inefficient. Maybe it's like kind of an authenticity worry, like I can't really be myself because I have to like conform my behavior to you. Maybe it's also like a kind of well-being worry, like I'm going to be in this state of like anxiously worrying about what you think all the time, and that's bad for me psychologically. Maybe it's all of these things. So again, like, would we expect pressures to behave strategically in this way under AI domination? Again, like, it depends on how exactly these systems are involved in everyday life, what kinds of roles they play, how much people know about all of this stuff. But I think, again, you can easily imagine scenarios where some powerful AI is out there, but it isn't interacting with most people. And it's at least not like, you know, messing around with the random humans on the street and like policing their behavior. So there again, like it's hard to see why people would engage in this sort of strategic calculation because, you know, the AI isn't coming for you personally. You don't have to like worry about offending it or something. There are other sort of intermediate scenarios, like again in the culture setting. You have these sort of AI agents that are like going around and making sure people aren't like committing horrible crimes. So there's the kind of gentle pressure to behave like in a pro-social way. So I guess that forces some amount of strategizing because you don't want to get caught committing crimes. But like that doesn't seem so bad. Probably you're going to need something like that in any kind of, you know, foreseeable scenario. You know, forcing people to think strategically in ways that makes them good citizens doesn't seem like such a terrible thing. So again, like you can think of cases where there would be more need for strategizing when, you know, AI or AI agents are more directly involved in kind of policing what people are doing. But I don't think this is like unavoidable. It doesn't seem like a major intrinsic harm of AI controlling the future. Okay, finally is uncertainty. Here again, so pretty straightforward. The idea is if I can mess with you and you don't know how or when I might do that, you know, that creates a lot of uncertainty. You don't know. It makes it hard for you to plan for the future because I could sort of strike at any time. It probably causes you some anxiety. It makes it hard for you to make sort of long-term plans. And I think out of the three, you know, alleged harms, I think this one is the most plausible as something that's like might be hard to avoid in an AI domination scenario, right? It does seem like in a lot of cases, a lot of possible scenarios, having a super intelligence, you know, controlling humanity's fate, it would be quite reasonable to worry about your future in that setting, right? You don't know exactly what it's going to do probably. You don't know how that's going to affect your life and your plans. Right? So some people seem to think that this isn't such a big problem, that, you know, all we have to do is solve alignment or develop like provably safe AI. And then we'll get to this future where AI is running the show, but we never ever have to worry about it doing, you know, interfering with us. That seems pretty implausible to me. I'm not sure that there is any implementation of those ideas that actually would lead to that outcome, where like you really could just go around being completely secure and completely unworried about what AI might do, even assuming that like these ideas make sense, which I'm not totally sure about. In a more like culture type scenario, you know, there's these benevolent AIs running things, but sorry, but they still get people involved in wars and political intrigues and other kinds of messes, and lots of people die. And you never really know when that's going to happen because, you know, you're just the poor, powerless humans, and you have no say in these sort of wider cosmic wheelings and dealings. So And it's easy to think of cases where like there's even more uncertainty under less optimistic assumptions. So I do think this is a very realistic prospective harm of AI controlling the future. It's hard to think of cases where most people would have no reason at all to feel worried or uncertain. Okay, so that's almost at the end. So the main conclusions here. First of all, I do think it's right that if AI systems come to possess control of the future, they probably will dominate most or all of us. But it's not clear that some of the things that are supposed to be bad about that kind of domination will actually come to pass as a result. In particular, I think harmful subordination and this kind of strategic behavior, it seems like we might well avoid those kinds of harms, even if we lose control. So I think that's an interesting result for political philosophers because this suggests that power relations that involve AI might have some unique under-theorized features. Because Pettit seemed pretty sure that whenever you reduce domination, you also reduce these other things and vice versa. But this seems to call that into question. I do think it's plausible that AI domination will create harmful kinds of uncertainty. So I think in at least that way, an AI that controls the future would be bad, even if it's human-friendly in other ways. Okay, one thing to note before I finish is that what I've been trying to do here is mostly assess the badness of AI domination in absolute terms. Of course, for lots of purposes, you might instead want to compare these scenarios to alternatives, ones that maybe you take to be likely or possible. I'm not trying to do that here. So in particular, I'm not claiming that AI domination would be worse than like what we have now. I'm not saying there would be more domination. There's a lot of domination in the world as it is. Maybe there would be less, but perhaps there would still be some. So, or maybe you have some other vision of the future where there's no AI and everyone lives in peace and harmony, and there's a way to get rid of domination in that way. I'm not making these kinds of comparative claims. Okay, here's a few open questions. Some of these things I've thought about, some of them, well, all of them I would like to hear your thoughts about. So we've just talked about these three purported ways in which domination is supposed to be bad from Pettit's work in the 90s. It's not totally obvious to me that those are the only ways in which domination is bad or could be bad. Maybe there's some other ones. That would be interesting to know. Another question is, if we want an AI system that controls the future, but sort of commits the fewest of these domination-related sins, what would that be like? How could we get to there from here? One thing that's going on right now that is maybe relevant is like companies like OpenAI have been investing in these kind of democratic AI initiatives that seem to be aiming at somehow getting people democratically involved in like the shape that AI takes, with an eye toward like future AGI, not sort of like just arbitrarily controlling everything. Are those initiatives actually likely to help? I'm not sure. If anyone knows a lot about those, it would be interesting to hear. One last thing you might be worried about is like, well, especially in view of the talks about AI well-being that we've had this week, is the reverse worry actually the worse one? Should we be more worried about humans dominating AI than AI dominating humans? I don't know. But anyway, yeah, thanks.